All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Chicago Archaeological Society. For you that are just joining us, let me tell you a little bit about us. Who is the Chicago Archaeological Society? From what I understand, our group goes all the way back to the 1920s when archaeology was still fairly new. It has taken many forms over the years. By at least the 1960s, they were using the name the Chicago Archaeological Society. And sometime after 1969, we became a chapter of the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology, the IAAA, which is a group that we belong to. And there are several chapters around the state that are dedicated to unite persons interested in the archaeology of Illinois, amateurs, professionals, students, and educators. But at the CAS, Chicago Archaeological Society, we do take it one step further, and our mission is to study the existence of all mankind. So as a member of the Chicago Archaeological Society, you'll receive the Codex. Here, let me show you what it looks like. This is our newsletter that our members take great care in creating for you. So we have this monthly newsletter coming out, was that eight times a year, I believe. And also, you become a member of the IAAA, the Illinois Association for the Advancement of Archaeology. And you get Illinois Antiquity, which is a journal from the association that publishes wonderful articles and photos of all the work that is being done in the state of Illinois. So if you'd like to find out more, check out our website, the Chicago Archaeological Society.com. If you'd like to join our mailing list, shoot us an email, info@chicagoarchaeology.org. And for our members, thank you for your support. Without you, we couldn't have the group. So thank you for all your support. And for those that would like to support us, I encourage you to join. That's how we pay the bills. So, and create the newsletter and have Zoom, and hopefully eventually soon have in-person events. All right. So last month we had a member and former professor from the city colleges, Michael Ruggieri, talk about the trade between Mesoamerica and the ancient Southwest. And next month on Halloween, we're going to have Dr. Charles Beaker, aspects of Indiana University's Center for Underwater Science Archaeological Projects. But today we have Dr. Randy Haas. Now, these are some words that are a little difficult for me to pronounce. Wilamaya, Patjxa, and female hunters of the early Americas. Dr. Haas, Randy Haas, is an archaeologist and assistant professor of anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California. His research team has challenged the long-held stereotypes about ancient people and gender. You can discover more about Dr. Haas's work at his webpage here, anthropology.ecdavis.edu/WRHAAS. All right. So without further ado, let's Dr. Haas take the stage here. Let me unshare my screen and let him share his.
Good to go?
Looks great.
Okay, so before I begin, just out of respect for those who might find images of skeletal remains offensive, I want to note that this presentation does include imagery of human remains, which are central to the argument. Please note that all the research was conducted in collaboration with the affiliated Aymara community of Muyafasiri and in accordance with Peruvian federal cultural resource law. But if you prefer not to view these images, please feel free to part ways and contact me for a version without burial imagery. My email address is wrhaas@ucdavis.com. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the lands from which this presentation and research takes place. The central case study presented comes from the lands of the Aymara community of Muyafasidi in Puno, Peru, as I already mentioned. Our field station was based in the community of Totorani, also in Puno, Peru, and members of these communities collaborated in this research. At this particular moment, I happen to be presenting from the sovereign lands of Waiwia Tanong, also known as Detroit, the homeland of the Three Fires Confederacy, granted by the Ojibwa, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Wyandot nations in 1807 through the Treaty of Detroit. Much of this research was carried out in Davis, California, which is Patwin land associated with three federally recognized Patwin tribes: Kachil Dihi, Band of Winton Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal Dihi Winton Nation, and Yocha Dihi Winton Nation. Last but not least, thank you to the Chicago Archaeological Society for inviting me and having me share this research with you today. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Randy Haas. I'm an archaeologist, and I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Davis, and at Wayne State University in Detroit, not too far away. Today, I'll present to you my recent research on female hunters of the early Americas, the site of Wilamaya Patjxa, and female hunters of the early Americas. So I actually published this research back in last November, but since then it's received a range of media responses. So I want to do something a little bit different than I've done in some other presentations. Because folks have asked me to speak to this. First, I'm going to present to you an abbreviated version of the findings. The thing I'm going to do differently at that point is I'm going to talk about the media response to those findings. So I'll talk about some of the exaggerated depictions of the research, some misunderstandings, and also some of the ways that this research has been, that folks have been engaging with this research and applying it to sort of everyday discourse surrounding the topic of gender. So let's start by talking about the findings and the substance of this presentation. The story begins site of Wilamaya Patjxa, which is located in the interior high Andes Mountains of southern Peru at an elevation of about 3,800 meters above sea level. That's about 12,600 feet above sea level. As many of you know, this is a cold, oxygen-starved, resource-poor landscape that really challenges human survival. And this is why I actually conduct a lot of my empirical research in this region, to understand how people solved those adaptive challenges. And I'm particularly interested in forager societies, how the first foragers of the region, the first people to inhabit the region, brought subsistence, technology, and social organization to bear on those challenges, how those adaptive, and then in turn, how those adaptive strategies paved the way for emergent complexity, for emergent agricultural economies, and eventually state formation. Now, a lot of you who are familiar with the region know that this is the part of the world where the Tiwanaku state first emerged, and eventually was part of the Inca Empire as well. So in 2013, I was working at a Middle Archaic period site, about 8,000 to 6,500 years old, called Soromikaya Patjxa. This is a site that was discovered by Mark Aldendorfer in 1997, I think it was. And you can see it's shown here in the background of this. Are you guys, Ray, can I get a check? As I flip through screens here, are you seeing that, or are you just seeing my presentation screen?
We see your screen.
You just see my presentation? You don't see?
Yes, we see the presentation.
No,
Okay.
we see the slide he's showing.
This is, okay, excellent. I got a little note popped up saying something about screen visibility or something like that. So everything's okay. Okay, good.
Yeah, we can see landscape.
The landscape, good. Okay, thank you. Weird screen popped up. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so you can see Wilamaya Patjxa in the background of this photo. And while we were working there, my Aymara colleague, Mr. Albino Pilko Kispe, introduced me to a site on his agricultural land, which later came to be called Wilamaya Patjxa. And here's what the site and the landscape look like today. In the foreground, you can see our excavation units, our excavation trenches, which roughly define the site boundaries. You can see that this is a vast treeless landscape dissected there. You can see some rivers dissecting the landscape, and there are mountains flanking this large plain, this large treeless plain. The linear striations that you see in this image, these are agricultural plow tracts. Today, Aymara communities grow potatoes, quinoa, and barley here. And so when Albino showed me this site, I became immediately intrigued by a dense concentration of projectile points, atlatl or dart points, including some that I knew were early forms. And so I recognized in this site an opportunity to study the earliest archaeological culture of the region, known to inhabit the region, sometime between about 11,000 to 9,000 years ago. Now, at that time, my research wasn't focused on that time period, on that what we call the early archaic period, and I didn't have permits to work at Wilamaya Patjxa, so we didn't work on it at the time. But in 2017, I was hired at UC Davis and had an opportunity to take a new research direction. And with that new opportunity, I immediately made a beeline for Wilamaya Patjxa. So in the summer of 2018, I initiated excavations at the site. And when excavating there, approximately 30 centimeters below the surface, we would occasionally encounter these dark ovoid stains like the one that you see here. These are cultural pit features. They're darkened by ash and created by fires and tell us of human activity. Now, that season, we excavated about 12 pit features, 5 of which contained 6 human burials in total. The burial locations are shown here on the map on the right. All of these burials were concentrated near the center of the site. Individual 1, the first individual we encountered, was an adult male associated with 2 projectile points of a form that date between about 9,000 and 7,000 years before present. The next 4 individuals that we encountered weren't associated with any grave goods. And this general lack or paucity of grave goods was basically what we expected among what we perceived to be a relatively egalitarian forager population, a population that was highly mobile, probably didn't accumulate much wealth. And so we expect very few things to be buried with them. And this is essentially what we see at this site. But this is also why individual 6, the 6th individual and last individual we encountered that season, Wilamaya Patjxa 6 or WMP 6, was really particularly surprising to us. Burial 6 was located about 1 meter below the surface. They were immediately recognizable as an adult individual, ceremoniously laid to rest in a semi-flex position on their left side. The bone preservation, as you can see, is rather poor. Much of the bone has long ago disintegrated, but parts of the cranium, the teeth, the leg bones were intact and sufficiently so that we could make out the layout of the burial. Here you can see a drawing of the burial. And what was most unusual and exciting about this individual was this concentration of 22 stone artifacts, most of which were neatly stacked in a pile near the individual's hip. This stacking of artifacts is important because it indicated that the artifacts were likely contained in a perishable bag at the time of death. They were not accidentally associated with the individual. It seems like they were included as part of some kind of kit at the time of death. So here we show the tools cleaned up. They're a little bit hard to see in the original image, but after you clean them up, they should become rather obvious. The tools are very clearly related to a big game hunting economy. 6 projectile points, which you can see here, numbers 1 through 6, were likely used for dispatching big game, probably vicuña or taruca, or both, the 2 indigenous big game species in the region today, and probably at the time Wilamaya Patjxa was inhabited. There was a series of flakes, some of them with and some of them without retouch, which were probably used in butchering animals. There were 2 well-made end scrapers, numbers 15 and 16, which you can see over here on the right, which were likely used for detailed hide working. There were 3 large choppers, which may have been used for butchering or coarse hide processing or bone working. There were red ochre nodules, which you can see down here in the lower right, numbers 22 through 24, along with a couple of small burnishing tools, 20 and 21, which had red ochre staining on the ends of them, which were likely used in hide processing as well. So clearly this was a toolkit geared towards a big game economy for all aspects of the economy, from dispatching animals to processing the animals. Also interesting was the fact that this individual was permitted to take so many artifacts, so many tools with so much remaining utility to the grave, suggesting that this individual, unlike the others that we had encountered, had garnered an unusual status within the community. The Tool Association led us to identify the individual as a hunter. This photo actually shows the moment when the burial was completely uncovered. There was considerable interest, and everyone in the team had gathered around to discuss what we were observing. And I remember the conversation quite well. It went something like, "Oh, he must have been a great hunter. Maybe he was a warrior or a great chief." In hindsight now, I sort of imagine that some of the crew members were like thinking in the back of their minds, "How do you know it's he, right? Huh? Are you sure it's he?" But this was the conversation at that particular moment. And to be fair, I don't think our thought process, our hypothesis at the time was an unreasonable one. Intuitively, we considered that the individual was simply the owner of the toolkit. Artifacts that accompany people in death tend to be those that they used in life. And so while many will note that that burial treatment is complex, it's culturally contingent, the intuition that grave goods reflect an individual's activities in life has empirical support. There's one systematic study that I'm aware of that was conducted of these kind of burial artifact associations that was led by Louis Binford, who examined the Human Relations Area Files, an archive of cultural behaviors. And in that research, he found that most common were differences in the types of goods disposed of with the body. These differences were related to sex-differentiated clothing, personalities, and tools, which symbolized male-female division of labor. Such distinctions frequently cross-cut additional ones made with regard to other dimensions of the social persona, such as membership, group affiliation, social position, etc. So, Binford was observing that while burial practice is very, very complex and culturally specific, there's one pattern that really seems to rise above it all, and that's that people tend to be buried with the tools that they use in life, and these generally tend to conform to gendered understanding of those behaviors. So following this logic, we initially interpreted WMP6 as a big game hunter. And furthermore, we assumed that the individual was male, which made sense given observations made in hunter-gatherer ethnography. If we look at hunter-gatherer or forager ethnography, we see a strong division of labor pattern. Several studies show that female labor tends to be focused on gathering plant resources and small game, while male labor is focused on big game hunting. And so strong is this ethnographic pattern that the forager anthropologist Robert Kelly recently highlighted it as one of as the one behavior that he thought transcended nearly all forager societies. He writes, after I wrote a book about modern hunter-gatherers, a colleague asked me if there were anything about them that I thought could be extrapolated back in time. Very few things, I replied, but one was the division of labor. Among living hunter-gatherers, men hunt large game and women collect plant food, small game, and shellfish. The reason is that they often have breastfeeding children with them, and small children are not compatible with hunting. So again, our initial model of a male big game hunter seemed quite reasonable to us at that moment. But things got really interesting back in the lab. My bioarchaeologist collaborator, Dr. Jim Watson, who's shown from the University of Arizona, who's shown here in the background of this photo, tentatively identified the WMP6 hunter as a female. Now, Jim was cautious about this interpretation at the time. He noted that the preservation was poor, and so the skeletal materials didn't allow confident sex estimation. But he did note that the skeletal structure was rather gracile and fit most closely with his understanding of female skeletal variation. Jim also determined at the time with more confidence that from the teeth of WMP6 that the individual was 17 to 19 years old at the time of death. So Jim's tentative identification of the individual as female was unclear at that moment, but Jim is really a fantastic bioarchaeologist. He's probably looked at more hunter-gatherer skeletons than most bioarchaeologists. So when he pointed out this observation, it was something to take seriously and to follow up on. Fortunately, at that time, I had been collaborating with a forensicist, Dr. Glendon Parker at UC Davis. And Dr. Parker had recently developed a technique for accurately estimating the sex of individuals using a type of sex-linked protein called amelogenin protein, which occurs in the dental enamel. This is a particularly exciting new technique for archaeologists because it applies to the part of the skeleton that is best preserved and is more resistant to degradation than, for example, DNA. So I'm not going to go into the details about this method. So for those of you who are interested in the method and also the efficacy of the method, I direct you to a 2020 paper led by Dr. Parker and Dr. Tammy Buonasera, which compares this method to more traditional osteometric techniques as well as ancient DNA approaches. And what the paper shows is that this new amelogenin technique is much more reliable than either, especially for really old samples. So when Dr. Parker, along with Tammy, Dr. Buonasera examined this WMP6 individual, the amelogenin proteins in their teeth, they confirmed Watson's female sex estimate. You can see some of the details on the metrics they used. For those of you who are chemists, you may understand what they mean. But the conclusion was very definitively this was a female individual. So it was at this moment that we realized that the hunter, who we thought was male, was actually female. We also conducted analyses to evaluate our hypothesis that the individual was a hunter. Jennifer Chen, who was an undergraduate at University of California, Davis, and is now a PhD student at Penn State University, examined the bone isotope chemistry under the guidance of Dr. Yelmer Irkins at UC Davis. And again, I'm not going to go into details about this, but just basically know that this shows that you are what you eat. We won't go into the details of stable isotope chemistry, but the plot basically shows that that the WMP6 individual, and we also did the WMP1 individual, falls in this space between plant resources over here on the left, these green dots, and camelid foods. So their bone chemistry is sort of an average of those two things, indicating that they had probably a mixed diet of plants and animals. Supporting the idea that hunting played at least an important part of the life way of this individual, and actually both these individuals, WMP1 and WMP6. Sarah Noe, who's a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara, examined the site's faunal assemblage. And faunal remains were quite abundant, but unfortunately they were extremely fragmentary, small little pieces that were really difficult to identify. Nonetheless, Sarah was able to make a number of secure taxonomic identification. And these were almost entirely big game animals, camelid and deer bone. Importantly, no terrestrial mammal bone was observed. Here in this chart, TM means terrestrial mammal. And so this is the kind of faunal assemblage that we would expect from an economy focused on big game. No fish bone either. Oh, so we're highlighting camelid and deer, most abundant, and terrestrial mammals. So, of course, now we have something of a paradox on our hands. Our understanding of hunter-gatherer social organization was that males were big game hunters, females were gatherers, and that people tended to be buried with the tools that they used in life. Yet we had on our hands a female buried with big game hunting tools. So how were we to make sense of this? In my effort to reconcile this observation with this man the hunter model, I initially supposed that the Andes was an exception to this man the hunter rule. At the time, I was thinking, this is cool. I'm working at Wilamaya Patjxa to study highland adaptation. Maybe something about female hunting is what it was part of that adaptation to this difficult environment. Maybe broad participation in hunting was part of the solution to high elevation adaptation. So I thought, oh, this is exciting. So on the one hand, I thought I had potentially identified a rare exception to the man the hunter rule, either an anomalous individual or an anomalous archaeological culture in which females participated in big game hunting in the past. On the other hand, I was also aware of the perils of projecting the present onto the past. Maybe hunter-gatherer ethnography isn't the right model for this Andean hunter-gatherer society who lived 9,000 years ago. In a seminal 1978 article published in the journal American Antiquity by Dr. Martin Vobst, Vobst referred to such analogical reasoning as, quote, the tyranny of the ethnographic record. And he urged archaeologists to let the past speak for itself rather than to assume it from the ethnography. After all, the human past covers some 50,000 plus years, depending on how you define human. So it would seem unwise to let the last 100 years stand in for all of the diversity of human behaviors that could have existed in the past, and in this time, 9,000 years ago, in the Andes. In addition, a number of scholars had proposed the theoretical reasons to suspect that prehistoric forager organization may have been fundamentally different in the past. For one, big game may have been more important in early diets. Oh, excuse me. Early on in the Americas, there would have been few people on the landscape and presumably a lot of animals. So folks would have been justified in spending more time and effort pursuing big game. They would have been on the radar of more people. It turns out that that the high mobility that is entailed by big game hunting, people tend to move towards the big game populations. This actually favors reproduction. It turns out that high residential mobility that's entailed by big game hunting actually results in less mobility overall, which is actually very good for reproduction. Doesn't mean it means you don't have to carry your children to your resource patches as far. And so this actually favors female participation in big game hunting as well at that time. The scholar Dr. Sarah Hurdy has pointed out that alloparenting is an important part of our species' evolutionary history, a fundamental aspect of human behavior. Alloparenting is the care of individuals who are not the care of children who are not your own, whether close kin or unrelated individuals. And alloparenting would have freed females up to participate in hunting. It's also possible that cooperative hunting was more important in the past. And cooperative hunting not only allows females to participate in hunting, but also allows children to participate in hunting. And I've done some theoretical work that shows that that in cooperative hunting, there's an economy of scale. The more people you can get to participate, the better the returns are for everyone who participates, the more success you have. And so this would compel everyone in the community, every able-bodied individual, to participate in big game hunting. Last but not least, the hunting technology at the time, the atlatl, can be learned at a relatively young age, importantly before young women reach menarche. And because of this, they're able to gain peak proficiency in the use of the atlatl before they are obligated to childcare tasks. So this puts males and females on an equal playing field in terms of learning this hunting technology and becoming proficient in this technology. And this idea comes from research by Dr. Bridget Grun, who published a really nice American Anthropologist article a few years back. Incidentally, the situation is a little bit different with the bow and arrow, which takes a little bit longer to gain peak proficiency. So for all of these reasons, we suspected, we had reason to, well, we had two hypotheses that we needed to unpack. On one hand, we had this sort of man the hunter model, in which case the Andean case was an exception. On the other hand, we had some theoretical reasons to think that, well, maybe this was part of a broader pattern. Maybe the Wilamaya Patjxa hunter was not just a one-off, but part of a broader pattern of female hunting early in the Americas. So the next thing I did was to evaluate these competing models by looking at published data from other early sites throughout the Americas. So given the man the hunter hypothesis, we should expect to observe that outside of the Andes, males were preferentially interred with big game hunting tools. And given the alternative anyone can hunt model, we should expect to observe that females and males are just as likely to be associated with big game hunting tools, or at least nearly so. Now, I couldn't just go out and excavate more burials in and outside the Andes. That would have been impractical. So what I did was I scraped the literature for any information on published burials. And I compiled from the literature the data that you see here. This included 427 individuals from 107 sites throughout the Americas, dating between about 13,000 or 14,000 and 8,000 years before present. We limited the search to burials before 8,000 years before present to get a sense of sort of early burial practices, but not so early that we were unduly limiting our sample. So 8,000 years and earlier was kind of the sweet spot. And this exercise led to three key observations. The first observation was a systematic bias in how burials tended to be interpreted by archaeologists. Burials with hunting tools tended to be interpreted as male, or if hunting tools were found with females, they were explained away as anomalies. So, for example, one study of a Pleistocene burial claimed that, quote, since the burial has been determined to be a female, the inclusion of a projectile point preform has been difficult to explain. However, if the artifact had been used as a knife or scraper, typically women's tools, then its inclusion with the burial is a more consistent association. Now, I observed several instances of this kind of circular reasoning. Now, to be fair, this might be a perfectly reasonable interpretation for any one burial, given what is known from hunter-gatherer ethnography and projecting hunter-gatherer ethnography onto the past. However, the meta-analysis that we were doing afforded us a much broader view for the first time, and I took a more rigorous, objective approach, which did not permit the sex estimation of the burial to influence our interpretation of tool functionality, nor tool type to influence our interpretation of the sex of the individual. We try to do something a little different here, a little more objective. And when we did this, when we counted up all of the burials for which big game hunting tools were associated with individuals in which sex could be estimated, here's what I observed. I observed 27 individuals from 18 sites associated with hunting tools. 11 of those individuals were female, 16 were male. This actually translates to a 40-60 ratio, which given this sample size is statistically indistinguishable from a 50-50 ratio. It's a statistical parity. And doing some binomial probability math, we were able to show that that given these numbers, the population of hunter burials would have had to included somewhere between 30 to 50% females in order to produce the results that we see in the archaeological record. So these data support our second model, the hypothesis that early females were big game hunters. Now, as is often the case in archaeology, not all observations are clear-cut. In fact, most observations are not. Sex estimations and artifact associations are sometimes tentative or dubious. DNA or proteomics test estimates, for example, have been performed on relatively few samples. So many of the sex estimates based on traditional osteometric methods. So if we just look at the secure observations, those burials for which sex estimations, artifact associations, and dating were secure across the board, what we see is that there's only 3 early individuals remaining, 3 that are confidently associated with big game hunting tools. And importantly, none of them are males. All 3 are females. Also importantly, 2 of the females or female infants from the Upward Sun River site in Alaska. So these were not hunters per se. Infants, as far as I know, cannot be hunters. But I'll return to this in a moment. That leaves the WMP6 individual, the WMP6 female, as the most secure observation of a hunter burial, making her the earliest adult individual associated with big game hunting tools in the Americas. So in sum, whether we take the most liberal or conservative approach or anything in between, we slice this a dozen different ways. We always got the same answer, that females were part of the sample, that they comprised a non-trivial portion of that sample. So we therefore find support for our second model that females were big game hunters in the early Americas. Okay, so there are a lot of other details that appear in our article that was published in the November issue of Science Advances. So if you're interested, I encourage you to go ahead and look at that article. What I'd like to do now is use the remaining time, and I think I have well, not a lot left, but about 10 minutes or so. I'd like to use the remaining 10 minutes or so to discuss the surprising media response to these findings at the request of some folks who asked me to discuss this. So this article's been out for a while now, and so there's been a lot of time for reactions to come out and for me to digest and think about them, respond to them. It's a rare chance to consider the ways that archaeology can exert immediate influence on contemporary conversations in society. In this case, the contemporary conversations that that people are having are about gender and society, and this site has become part of a small part of those conversations. So I want to focus on 3 aspects of the media response. I want to focus on criticisms of the study, application to discourse or conversations, as well as some exaggerated or hyperbolic depictions of female hunters. Now, I was able to derive a lot of this information about media response from the altmetric page for the article. This is a page that automatically compiles media mentions of the article, the media mentions in the internet. This includes things like news articles, blogs, tweets, Wikipedia pages, videos, etc. And indeed, the discovery was discussed quite a bit in the media. You can see here that it was among the top 100 scientific articles discussed in 2020. It was the most discussed paper in the category of history and archaeology. Incidentally, this doesn't mean it's a good paper. It just means that it got a lot of attention. Okay, so I want to start with some of the critiques that have emerged. Some have critiqued the inclusion of the Upward Sun River burials in our sample. Clearly, infants were not hunters and so can't be considered as evidence of female hunting, the argument goes. But I actually want to suggest otherwise. This is actually a picture of me as a young child, and my dad is in the background. He's a hunter. It's an important part of his identity, and clearly he thought that it should be an important part of mine as a male child. Now, I guarantee that if I had a sister or if I was a female, he would not have put me in a coonskin hat and posed me with a shotgun. And yet, that's a real shotgun. Don't judge my parents; they're good people. This association of a male child and hunting regalia is undoubtedly related to Western society's gendered understanding that hunting is a male activity. It does not seem unreasonable then to assume that the hunting tools with Upward Sun females similarly index that society's association between females and hunting. In fact, a really great recent study led by Shayna Lou Levy and Kate Ellis Davies shows that in hunter-gatherer societies, quote, learning begins early in infancy when parents take children on foraging expeditions and give them toy versions of the tools, end quote. So in this sense, I actually argue that infant burials may be an even stronger indicator of gendered labor practice in the past than adult burials. So I maintain that the evidence is consistent with female and male big game hunting in the early Americas. Another interesting and related critique is that maybe the tools associated with the female hunters are actually the offerings of mourning husbands. And this may be true. We can't reject this, but I like to call this the Homer Simpson bowling ball critique. In a particularly entertaining episode of The Simpsons, Homer realized that he'd forgot Marge's birthday. So he quickly runs out to the store and buys her a bowling ball with his name on it. And as you might imagine, Marge is not particularly happy with her gift, and their marriage unravels. And the episode's all about how Homer repairs his marriage. So if indeed hunting was a male activity in the past, a husband offering his tools to his wife seems to me a bit of like Homer giving Marge a bowling ball. It's something of maybe a slap in the face. Again, to be sure, I don't think it's an impossible scenario, but I do think it's unlikely that this kind of behavior pertained for so many female burials spanning all of the Americas over 4,000 years. I don't think we would get the sample that we get if this were the case. One of the most common criticisms related to the illustration we produced, strangely. Once we had assembled the paper, we realized that the findings might be of broad interest to non-archaeologists. So we wanted to produce an illustration to help non-archaeologists and the public visualize the finding in a more accessible way. Bones and stones just sometimes don't cut it for most regular people. So I worked with UC Davis scientific illustrator Matthew Vertolivo to produce this graphic, and he did a remarkable job, and he received quite a lot of praise for his artwork. However, many have said to me, this is an interesting finding, Randy, but why did you decide to depict the hunter wearing pink? Others have wondered, why is she wearing pants? Why is her hair look that way? Why is she wielding that funny looking atlatl? And I want to assure those critics that our illustration is carefully anchored in archaeological and ethnographic observations. She's shown wearing tailored leather clothing, which is consistent with the finding of end scrapers in her toolkit, as well as rock art depictions and theoretical work, which suggests that tailored leather clothing would have been critical to early life in the highlands. The color of the clothing is perfectly matched to the ochre nodule, as you can see here in the image, that was found in the WMP6 toolkit. So she's not wearing pink. She's wearing ochre-colored clothing. Her hair is similarly based on rock art imagery. Take a look at that, close look at that rock art imagery on the right there, and you'll see that folks are depicted with what appears to be a hairstyle kind of sticking up in the back. Those could be headdresses. Hard to say, but we chose to interpret them as a hairstyle. And the atlatl is based on camelid bone atlatls, which are found in cave sites in the southern highlands of the Andes. The projectile points are, of course, based on the projectile points found in the toolkits. So all of these design details are documented in the supplement of our article. So certain details will certainly prove to be wrong at some point. But I believe we've been as faithful as possible to the archaeology in making this construction. Early hunters of the Americas almost certainly did not associate colors with gender the way that we do in Western culture today. To color her clothing any other color than what the evidence suggests would play into contemporary gender stereotypes, contemporary gender biases. So we chose scientific accuracy over contemporary gender stereotypes. And nonetheless, the concerns actually offer an interesting and unanticipated case in Western interpretive bias. Now I'd like to highlight some of the ways that the findings have been taken up in contemporary conversations about gender today. Forbes magazine writes about the potential implications for corporate environments. In an article by Kim Elsesser titled, "Don't Blame Gender Inequality on Our Ancient Ancestors, Ancient Women Were Big Game Hunters Too." And in this, the author Kim Elsesser enumerates the ways that society and even scholars, particularly in evolutionary psychology, have used the man the hunter trope to justify workplace inequalities that women face today, particularly lower ranked and lower pay. The facts that women face lower ranks and lower pay on average than men. And she concludes that, quote, "Perhaps this archaeological finding will help refocus our search for the origins of some of today's gender differences." Here's a nice example of how the finding played into an informal conversation on Twitter. In a Twitter thread, a woman named Frances commented on gender bias in caregiving, stating that if society wants women to choose to be carers, it must recognize their valuable work. Instead of giving benefits, pay them a living wage and occupational pension. To which Tim responded, "Yes, but evolution, men were hunter-gatherers and women were home raising gardens and cooking, and women evolved to have more emotional ties to kids and family, and men don't have those emotions because they were killing animals all day." And Frances fired back, "That is BS from beginning to end," and then cited the Female Hunters of the Early Americas article. And in a classic effort to save face, Tim comes back with the old, "I know, I was just being sarcastic, LOL." A Salish storyteller, Kim Senclip Harvey, blogged about the findings. And she says, for example, "So to the wee ones, grab that fishing rod, hold that crayon, make that meal, and don't ever let any colonial construction obstruct you from doing exactly what your ancestors have always done." So these are a few ways that the findings are shaping contemporary discourse. I fundamentally believe that archaeology has an important role to play in society. Usually that role is pretty indirect. So it takes the accumulation of many small findings and subtle pathways to influence contemporary human actions. But once in a while, these effects are more immediate. And it's, sure is nice to see that when that happens. Last, I'd like to call attention to some of the more exaggerated depictions that have appeared. I don't want to criticize these outright, but I would like to maybe add a little more nuance. So let's take a look at a few. One common characterization is to paint a picture of ferocious hunter warrior women. A New York Times headline reads, "What new science techniques tell us about ancient women warriors?" And the WMP6 individual was featured prominently in this article. ArtNet News wrote that the most ferocious ancient hunters may have been women as often as men, a new archaeological finding suggests. Now, just to be clear, I never said anything about Wilamaya Patjxa being a warrior or anything about her personality as being ferocious or not. Another article listed in Live Science, WMP6 as one of 6 findings in 2020 that showed that women were badass. to use the term they used. And that may be the case. Maybe WMP6 was a badass. I don't know. Maybe not. But I think at the end of the day, to add a little more nuance to this, I think what the discovery does show is that women today and in the past were badass, and could have been badass. Whether or not these particular individuals were particularly aggressive or not, that's something else that remains to be seen. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this unfortunate title, Lady Killer, that appeared in Archaeology magazine that I was a little bit disappointed in. And we'll go ahead and skip this one. France TV is doing a special that's going to feature this finding too, that maybe paints some exaggerated depictions as well. So instead, what I'm going to leave you with is I'm going to share some concluding thoughts. And as I do that, I want to show this video clip. The analysis that I presented is consistent with a hypothesis of non-gendered labor practice in the early Americas. I want to acknowledge some of the reservations, noting that indeed the findings are not a slam dunk. They rarely are in archaeology. Nonetheless, the theory and the data align really well. And I would like to argue that the best model is one in which females routinely participated in big game hunting in the past. The media analysis highlights some rather extreme positions. I suspect that Western society's hyper-masculinization of hunting drives the polarization of responses. And that includes both the more conservative responses, those that reject the conclusions, and the more liberal responses, those that portray female hunters as fierce killers. I imagine that prehistoric hunting scenes looked more like this Ayamara Vicuña drive that I participated in not too long ago. I observed some interesting moments for sure in these drives, but this was generally a low energy affair. Women, men, and children all participated. This isn't to suggest that women in the past could not be ferocious or badass, as some of the headlines suggested. No, women were certainly badass in the past, just as they are today. Sometimes they hunted, sometimes they didn't. I see no reason why labor practice in the past could not have been quite fluid, varying with both ecological and social conditions. And we need to adjust our contemporary perceptions today accordingly. So that concludes the presentation of the archaeological findings and the media response. If you're interested in this study or my lab's research more generally, you can find more information at my lab website. We call ourselves the Forager Complexity Lab. And our mission is to explore the evolution of complex human behaviors through the archaeology of past forager societies. And you can see the web address here. And last but not least, I'd like to take a second to thank all the people who made this possible, not the least of whom are my colleagues of the community of Muya Fasidi, as well as my collaborators, et cetera. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haas. That was fascinating. And definitely challenging the stereotype about ancient women is interesting, especially since I have a strong connection to Peru because of my family, and it's interesting there how much the non-Western traditions still live on. The indigenous community there is it's not just something from the textbooks. It's there. It's living. It's breathing. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it seems that women's roles there are today still quite a bit different than they are in Western society. One of the expressions, and I don't know if Edith can comment on this, about in Native tradition is the more a woman beats you, like physically hits you, the more she loves you. It's a common expression from what I understand. So anyways, I notice we have a comment here from Monette. Where is Upward Sun River?
So that's a site in Alaska. It's a Paleo-Indian infant burial site in Alaska, and that one has really good identification of the sex of the individuals using DNA.
And no notice of the idea that women were hunting smaller game.
So in our faunal assemblage, we didn't get any small animal bones. No Viscacha, or other kind of small game species from the Andes. So we don't think small game were a particularly important part of the diet at that time. It's possible that's a preservation bias, but right now we have no reason to think that small game, anyone was really pursuing small game in a serious way. There's also ancient wild guinea pigs occur in that region, Kui, but people are not pursuing those either at that time.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to mention that. I'd be surprised if you didn't find Kui remains. I don't know if that's considered hunting them, because I mean they just live in your house.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they probably wouldn't have been domesticated at that time.
Oh, okay, so it's that long ago. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, 9,000 years ago, probably not. All right, that's possible.
Yeah. And then I want to also personally, she commented, personally, I think all humans in their ancient societies would have figured out what they were good at, and that's what they did. Several of the figures are shown with bigger hips. That's
a really good observation, Monette, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Yeah, I think that's true. Maybe I can share that. I've actually noticed that too, and I was kind of thinking it would be fun to do a formal analysis on that. And she's referring to, Monette, correct me if I'm wrong, you're referring to, there it is. This image on the right. Yeah, you'll notice that
that one. Yep.
Yeah, like right here, for example, this individual has really large hips.
Yep, the one right below.
Yep. Yeah, right there too. Yep. I think that's a very good observation that we're looking into. Yeah.
Yep.
And James is asking, what is the average lifespan for people at this time?
It's a little bit hard to say, but we have individuals, who in the assemblages who were older than 50. From the skeletal remains, it's a little bit difficult to refine the age beyond 50 years old, but at least some individuals were living that long. I suspect that life expectancies were generally on the shorter end, people probably living into their 30s, but with some individuals occasionally exceeding 50 years old, but hard to know beyond that.
Joe was asking, don't bones of men and women hunters show wear patterns that would indicate hunting?
Yeah, that would be another interesting line of evidence that we'd like to look at. Unfortunately, you saw that the preservation of the bone is pretty poor. So unfortunately, all of those kinds of markers that we might sort of like pronounce muscle attachment markers, maybe that might show folks who were more engaged in, using atlatls, or those who were grinding, for example. Those kinds of markers are not sufficiently preserved for us to examine that aspect of the record. Maybe we'll get lucky someday, though, and we'll find some with good preservation that'll show some of that.
James is asking, did any popular media report this story more accurately?
They were all, they're the media, so they were all kind of exaggerated, I think. Some of like Science and Nature reported it, and they did a good job, I thought. New York Times did another article. There were two articles in New York Times. The first one was pretty straightforward, just sort of laid out the facts pretty nicely, I thought. So yeah, I think there were some stories that were more accurate than others, and some were more sensational than others. We also did stuff, we were lucky to be able to do some interviews too, some radio interviews with like Science Friday and Quirks and Quarks and Canada's Science Friday and stuff too, where we were just able to, they let us tell the story, and they asked very good questions that ensured a level of accuracy. So yeah, I think a lot of them did quite well.
Did hunter groups or hunting media pick up on the story?
They did. There was a few stories by hunting groups. There was one really nice article by a woman hunter who blogs about hunting, who was really touched by the findings, who wrote a very nice article, like an ode to the Wilamaya Patjxa hunter. It was also blogged on Netflix has a hunting show. Oh shoot, I forget what it's called. I asked my dad, who I mentioned is a hunter, and he knew it. He knew the show. But they did a blog on it, a blog post as well. So there were definitely some who picked up on it. Not many though, not as many as you might think. And I suspect it's probably because, it's a fairly male dominated industry, who probably didn't find it that interesting of a finding.
All right. Sorry, I just changed my view. Oh, I'm going to ask, were the positions of the points in the burials indicative of how they were used? Is it possible in any of these cases that it had been buried in muscle at one time?
So yeah, the position of the points did give us some indication of how they were used, and the position definitively showed that these were not like homicide weapons. They were not embedded in like the human muscle or skeletal tissue or the body. It was very clear because they were stacked in a nice neat pile that they were probably in a bag, and could not have been in the body at the time of death. At the other site that I was telling you about in the beginning, Wilamaya Patjxa, we actually have an example of a dart point that was very clearly inside the chest cavity at the time of death. So there are instances where we can see some of these other kinds of associations. This is the best example where we can definitively exclude that possibility. WMP6.
Any other questions? And you all are certainly welcome to. Oh, we have another question. Was use-wear analysis done to any of the points?
Yeah. So no, we haven't done use-wear analysis yet. We're actually in the process of exporting the tools right now to do some use-wear analysis. Honestly, though, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, James, but I think where this question is coming from is like, well, maybe those projectile points weren't projectile points at all. Just like, that other article was saying, maybe they were knives. And maybe so if we do some use-wear analysis, we could determine if that was the case or not. And we're going to do the use-wear analysis, but honestly, I don't think it's going to tell us a whole lot about that, because one of the problems with use-wear analysis is that in general, it's really hard to detect projectile point use of stone artifacts, because they only go into the object a couple times, so they don't really leave. Projectile point use doesn't leave much use-wear that we can detect archaeologically. Although I don't know if you do use-wear analysis, James, so maybe you have a different thought process. But we're going to do it, and what we may learn is that maybe they were also used as knives or not, but it's hard to say.
I'm just a student of Lawrence Keeley in the past, and it's something he would have brought up.
Yeah, exactly. So Ashley Smallwood and Heather Rockwell are going to do we're going to have two people do the use-wear analysis independently and see what we can learn. And so then from Lawrence that basically what you're able to determine is sort of the direction of action, and maybe just sort of broadly what kinds of materials were being used. Was it being used on wood, bone, or flesh or not? So maybe we'll learn something. We're going to look at the projectile points as well as some of the flake tools and the scrapers. The scrapers, scrapers are used for scraping hides. It's that seems pretty pretty definitive, but who knows? Maybe we'll be surprised.
And you said in the beginning, if I remember correctly, that when you first started these excavations in this area, you were finding a lot of points and things either on the surface or nearby. Then you found these pits.
Right.
Were the things were those initial points you were finding associated with those pits, or could you not tell? Or
Oh, yeah. So the reason why we find, like, it's sort of it's the agricultural activity that's creating this pattern. They've been disc plowing there for the last like 10 or 15 years, which has disturbed the top 30 centimeters of deposit. So the good thing is that it's brought the artifacts to the surface so that we could actually detect the site. The bad news is that it's destroyed whatever associations those artifacts had. So it wasn't until we excavated that we got below that plow zone. We were lucky enough to find that some of the archaeological features had been dug in the past, been dug deep enough that they were, were able to evade sort of the plow mixing.
Thank you.
Yeah, good questions.
Question from Joe. I think you said your study stopped at 6,000 BP. Between then and European contact, it seemed women must have stopped hunting, else it would have been recorded by Europeans, don't you think? Why would women have stopped hunting? Have women stopped hunting?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So our study actually, just a finer point, stopped at 8,000 BP, but the question is still the same, right? So we have on one end, we have what seems to be clear evidence that there was broader participation in big game hunting in the past. And then we have sort of on the recent end in ethnography, where it seems that there is a pronounced sexual division of labor. So when did it change and why? And that's a question we're hoping to follow up on right now. And there's several different hypotheses. One is that, you ask here, it seems that women must have stopped hunting. It's possible, but one model is that really the pattern, the gendered pattern of division of labor that we see historically is actually a reflection of biases in the ethnographic recording, maybe missionization imposing biases, labor biases on indigenous populations. So those may not be an accurate reflection of labor practice in the recent past. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying that's one possibility. Another possibility is that there is a genuine shift in the division of labor, and I suspect that if that is the case at some time in the past, and I suspect that if that happened, it was probably, well, there's two possibilities. I think it was either when human populations got so large and big game populations got so depressed that that diets had to expand and intensify, and at that point, you have many more items on your menu, and at what point it helps to specialize within your family or community in different resources. And you're also moving around the landscape less, so you're more tethered to certain places on the landscape, or you're more packed in, territoriality sets in, and males go further for hunting and females stay close to home. So that's one possibility. As you get this sort of diet breadth expansion, sexual division of labor starts to make more sense. Another option too is that with the introduction of the bow and arrow, sexual division of labor makes sense as well. I mentioned earlier that the use of the atlatl is something of like a gender equalizer, because both men and women can reach peak proficiency before females reach reproductive age. With the bow and arrow, the time it takes to learn peak proficiency is much longer, into your teen years, at which point females might have been disadvantaged in learning that technology. And then, that sort of catalyzes a sexual division of labor as well. And so if that's the case, so there's very clear expectations for these different models. And what we need to do is look at burial practices going forward in time. If the diet breadth expansion model is correct, then we should start to see shifts in the burial practices around, let's say, like 7,000, 6,000 years ago. If the bow and arrow technology model is accurate, then what we might expect to see is that those burial practices shift around 2,000 years ago, when we start to see the introduction of bow and arrow into North America, or many parts of North America. If the sort of colonial processes model is accurate, then we expect that those burial practices not to change basically for the entirety of the North American archaeological record, and only to shift in the recent ethnographic record. So that's a really great question, and that's something we're thinking about.
Yep. Well, that brings up the change being agriculture was introduced, right? So the roles of not just women were changing, but men, everybody. So now you didn't have to go and hunt animals, because most of the big animals are domesticated in the Andes, right? Except for the like vicuña. So there was no reason to really hunt them. You just kept them.
Yeah, and I would sort of lump that in with the sort of the diet breadth expansion. Is that what as your sort of big game populations are depleted, you start broadening your diet, and this includes a lot more plant resources, but it also includes sort of domesticated resources as well.
Well, Randy, has anybody talked about who was mostly involved in making the pottery? Because that may have become more of a woman's thing too.
Yeah, that's right. So as other technologies, right? So you could kind of do this with any technology. I've chosen to focus on sort of the hunting technology because
It's more interesting though to think that they shared all the things equally, isn't it?
I'm sorry that they shared what?
It is, I think so.
I'm sorry.
What did they share?
They hunted.
Oh, so the audio broke up.
Yeah, sorry, the audio is breaking up for me too. Oh no, that seems like a really good point.
Darn internet.
Yeah. So anyway, but let's just roll with the pottery thing for a second. Yeah, I mean, we know when pottery came into various places in the Americas. So so that would be although we also see different times and places where men are potters and women are potters. But if that was an important factor in affecting sort of the change in labor patterns, then yeah, we would see shifts in burial practices around that time. And that's something that we hope to investigate. Yeah, sorry, Monette, that you didn't get to finish that thought.
Do we have any other questions? And you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask. Hopefully the internet will work for us all, or put it into the chat. This is certainly a fascinating topic and close to home to me. I really want to see Southern Peru.
Yeah.
Okay, go forever. What is next for this project?
Right now, honestly, we're just trying to get back down there. Yeah, so we actually, so the question about when labor practices changed is an important question that we hope to address, and that's more armchair archaeology work. So we can do that by evaluating the literature. In terms of field work, though, I desperately want to get back to Peru and continue excavating the site. As I mentioned, there's agricultural processes there that are, basically destroying the site. Every year that goes by, those plows dig a little deeper and more goes away. So I'm really motivated to try to get back down there. I'm trying to scrape together funds to continue this work. I'll be trying to submit some grant funding in the next few years. We to try to continue the excavations there to salvage the remaining archaeology and follow up on this hypothesis. So hopefully that'll happen sooner than later, pandemic permitting. We also got I can't mention that yet. I don't think. Well, I can kind of mention it. We're also about to receive some funding maybe I just won't say who the funder is, to do some public outreach work with this. We're going to be creating a comic book about our findings in collaboration with the Aymara community that will basically tell about the deep history of Aymara communities and sort of kind of subtly tell a narrative about sort of women's empowerment in the process.
Oh, wonderful. What audience is this for? Is this for the Peruvian audience or American or international?
Yeah, this is going to be announced tomorrow, so I think I can say it. It's the U.S. Embassy in Lima is funding it, we're basically, I think it's probably, we're doing it for like 4 different audiences. Most immediate, I think the embassy probably sees it as being for Peruvians. It'll be in Spanish. We'll do a Spanish version, an English version, and an Aymara version. But we're also going to make it freely available on the web. So it'll be available to a US audiences and a global audience.
I love it.
Dr. Haas, is it for children or adults? You said comic book, right?
Yeah, we're going to sort of target it sort of for like teenager age. So sort of make it accessible to a kind of a broad range.
So Ray, might your girl like to read about sort of her heritage there?
Absolutely. My children and their cousins would love such a thing. I actually do try to keep up on Peruvian comic books because their heroes are based on ancient cultures. It's really neat. They incorporate that.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll have to. Yeah, Ray, I might then, since you're familiar with this, I might come back and
Oh, sure.
insights if you're familiar with the Peruvian comic world. I'm not.
Yeah, like Cholo Power is their version of like Wonder Woman, and then they have one that's like a moche sculpture, which is kind of like the Thing from the Fantastic Four. Oh yeah, it's cool.
Oh, right on.
Yeah.
I read about Cholo girls. That was
Yeah, Cholo Power, Chola Power.
Cholo Power. Okay, I need to read that one. Okay. Anyway, so that was a long-winded version of what's coming next. There's a lot of things happening. There are a lot of smaller analyses. I mentioned the use-where analysis we're doing as well. So these are some of the things that we're hoping to accomplish, funding permitting.
Wonderful. Andy, you have a question?
Well, I haven't been in the midst of actual excavation for quite a while, but is mass spectrometry used to try to get any indication of what remains might be on the lithic tools?
So like, yeah, no, we haven't really done much in terms of like blood residue analysis, things like this. Maybe thinking, no, we could do that. And maybe I will. I'm sort of skeptical of that approach, honestly. I've seen a lot of weird results, and actually Tammy Buonasera, the collaborator who did the proteomics work for us for the sex estimation, I asked her about it. That was actually one of the first things I asked when I got back. I said, we've got these tools. Can we do blood residue analysis on it to figure out sort of what they were used for? And she cautioned me, and she's one of the best archaeochemists I know. And she said, I study proteins, I've done experiments, and those proteins degrade in a matter of seconds. There's like, in her mind, there's zero chance that they preserve, and the results that people get are generally spurious. So based on that, I decided not to invest time and effort into that approach. But my head was exactly in the same place as yours when we made this finding.
I was really interested. I paid attention to your burial and saw, how little you had to work with, and I was just sort of, interested in how the sex analysis was done. So excellent that the blood work has come along that way.
Yeah, the protein stuff's amazing. It was that was just we couldn't have asked for better timing on that. But it also vindicated Jim Watson's his prowess. He's quite good as a determining. He determined that the individual was likely a female individual just by looking at the meager remains that he had. Like you could see some of the markers on the cranium and the long bones fit in his estimation more in line with female individuals, and turned out he was right.
No, Hiram Bingham made a big mistake at Machu Picchu. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but for a long time, he wanted to say that this was like the Temple of Virgins, and then years later, it turned out that no, the bones were equally split between men and women.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's another good example. Yeah, and I think this new proteomic methods has a lot of potential to resolve a lot of similar kinds of issues. So I think we're going to see in the next 10 years or so, folks really putting that technique to use in a lot of contentious findings.
On the spear point, on the projectile points, as I recall seeing them, it looked as though they had two projections off the edge on one side and one projection off the edge on the other side.
Ray, could you give me screen sharing ability again? I can show
Oh,
that.
yeah, sure.
Do you know what that's about? I don't think I've ever seen a projectile point like that.
Yeah, so no, that's really interesting that you point that out. So actually you can see it on this one, here, right? Yeah.
So for 3 and 5.
Yep. So yeah, one and 2 and 4 have just one on each side. 3 and 5 have 2 off on one side, which is interesting. We call those ears, and those are just, it's just a cultural quirk. That's actually what clued us in when we were finding projectile points on the surface. I found a few of these, and that's what told me that this site was probably somewhere in the range of 11 to 9,000 years old, because other excavators working in other parts of the Andes had recovered these from contexts that dated to that time period. And I don't know the right term to use, but it's cultural idiosyncrasy. It's something people did when they made projectile points 11 to 9,000 years ago. And that seriation, that time frame, was vindicated with our radiocarbon dates on the burial, which came back at about 9,000.
And how long are those projectile points? I can't tell from.
What's the size of them? Actually, they're small. Actually, the ones that she's holding on her spear in the image are roughly to scale. So they're, what would that be? Just a few centimeters in length.
I'm just trying to figure if that's used to bind the point to the shaft as a place to attach to put your wrappings around.
Like up above to kind of lock.
All of them are, because the one on the left is midway between the two on the right in both 5 and 3.
Yeah, I would buy that. I'm not sure. In 5, it looks like you can see there's a little bit extra wear up here on this margin, which tells me that it may have broken and then was resharpened. But why you would add 2 spurs during the resharpening is unclear to me. Yeah.
That's interesting that those small ones are with atlatl, because in the Midwest, we tend to say that the small ones show that the bow and arrow had come in, and that earlier it was all the much heavier kind of points that would have gone with spears and also presumably atlatl.
So we actually just published an analysis on this where we compared these points to later points. Actually, we didn't quite publish this one, but anyway, we have analyzed that, and it turns out that in terms of width and mass, these still fall in the range of atlatl. They're small, but they're at the small end of atlatl. In terms of thickness, they actually start to teeter into bow and arrow size, but by most metrics, they fit within sort of the size expectations, the North American size expectations for atlatl.
Okay.
Yeah. But around 4,000 years ago in the Andes, the projectile points get really small. And we think that's probably about the time when the bow and arrow came in, smaller than these.
Great. Any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself.
But these are lots of great questions.
And I just want to remind everyone that next month on Halloween, we're going to have Dr. Charles Beaker, aspects of Indiana University's Center for Underwater Science and Archaeological Projects. Any further questions or announcements before we close out the meeting? And if you like what you saw today and you want to see more and great speakers like Dr. Haas, please join us at chicagoarchaeologicalsociety.com. I'd like you to join and send you the codex and our newsletter and the IAAA's magazine, and get on our mailing list. So hopefully those who are interested in joining will join. And those that have, thank you. All right, I think that about wraps it up for today, unless there's any other questions. Thank you, Dr. Haas. This was awesome. And thank you for coming on. I hope to have you a speaker again. I want to see the progress.
All right. Well, I'd be happy to come back. Thank you for having me. Thanks for all your help, Ray. And Brenna and I think Lucy and some others who helped make this possible. I appreciate it.
I will make sure my crew, Jerry's deposits a check for your lab. He's not in the meeting today, but I'll get after him.
We appreciate the contribution. Thank you.
All
You're
right.
very welcome.
All right. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. See you in October.